I'm going to be making another graph in this problem. Although this one doesn't look from the beginning that it's a function defined in pieces, but in fact, the absolute value, which I'm calling for in the numerator, is defined in pieces. A very handy way of thinking about it is that the absolute value of a quantity, in this case x plus 1, is treated one way if x plus 1 is positive, well, if it's positive, the absolute value is simply it. But it's treated entirely differently if it's negative. Well, if x plus 1 is negative, the absolute value, the handiest way is to think it's the opposite. For example, the absolute value of negative 7 is the opposite of negative 7. It's 7. And to write that, to make sure that I'm getting the exact opposite of x plus 1, I put the negative out front of this guy. And I think that's going to permit us to make a graph of this. So I'm looking here. If this is true, that means that x is bigger than negative 1. Well, what's the value of my function? If x is bigger than negative 1, f of x is, well, the absolute value is simply x plus 1. And I divide by x plus 1. So for any value of x that's bigger than negative 1, f of x is simply 1. That's easy. It's a nice horizontal line. The y value is constant at 1. How about if x is less than negative 1? In that case, we're down here. X plus 1 will be less than 0. What do I get? I get the opposite of it. So f of x, the absolute value, is now the opposite of x plus 1 divided by x plus 1. When you divide something by its opposite, you get negative 1. So for all x values less than negative 1, I get a y value of negative 1. So let's see if I can squeeze that on my graph. How about negative 1? Well, if x is, not 0, negative 1, I'm in trouble because the denominator is 0. So the function is not defined. There will be no point that has an x-coordinate of negative 1. All the points to the right have a y value of 1. Again, I'm going to signify that this applies only to values that are bigger than negative 1, not for negative 1 itself. For values that are less than negative 1, I take a y value of negative 1. That should be a horizontal line, and I think I can do better than what I drew here. So this is our function, and I think what's going to be very important if you start thinking about absolute value in this way, that absolute value is, if the quantity is positive, it's simply the value. Absolute value, if the quantity is negative, it is the exact opposite value. That will make this kind of problem very straightforward. And there's the graph.